The bustling crowd at Chicago O'Hare buzzed with excitement as passengers boarded Flight 2457. Bound for New York City, some hurriedly scrolled through emails. Others clutched novels, earbuds, or simply gazed out at the looming metal bird that would soon carry them away. Among them, with a calm yet purposeful stride, walked Captain Amelia Hayes. Today was different. Today, Amelia was not at work, though she carried herself as if she were. As one of the few black female pilots to have earned the title of captain, Amelia was no stranger to the challenge of having to prove herself. She had piloted countless flights across the country, handled emergencies, and overcome barriers few could fathom. Now, however, she was just a passenger, looking forward to a rare moment of relaxation and the anticipation of reuniting with family. Approaching the gate, Amelia checked her first-class boarding pass. It was a small luxury she had allowed herself, one that, after years of dedication, she rightfully deserved. She handed the ticket to the gate agent, a young woman named Becky Martin, who glanced down at the pass with an expression that seemed to flicker briefly between surprise and something else. "Excuse me," Becky said, eyeing Amelia from head to toe. "It appears there's been a mix-up. You're actually seated in economy class." Amelia's brow furrowed. She took the ticket back and looked at the bold lettering. First class. Seat 1A. There was no mistake. She had booked this ticket herself weeks ago, carefully planning each detail. "I'm sorry, there's no mistake," Amelia said politely, showing her ticket to Becky again. "This seat was reserved for me." Becky hesitated, her eyes darting toward a group of nearby staff members who now seemed to watch the exchange. A hint of doubt crept into Amelia's mind, but she kept her voice steady. She had been here before. It was a familiar sensation, this careful, barely concealed scrutiny that followed her like a shadow, lingering whenever her credentials or competence were questioned. With a forced smile, Becky turned back to Amelia. "I'll need to check with the supervisor," she said briskly, before striding away without waiting for a response. Amelia felt a prickling unease as she waited. Passengers brushed past, some sneaking curious glances her way. She was used to the attention, but today, each second stretched longer than the last. Soon, the tall, older man arrived, the supervisor, Paul Howard. He barely spared Amelia a glance as he looked down at her ticket, flipping it over with a mild irritation. "This is a first-class ticket," he muttered, his tone dismissive. "But we seem to be overbooked. There's only space left in economy." Amelia's mouth tightened, though she maintained her calm exterior. She wasn't here to make a scene. Yet there was something beneath Paul's words that felt pointed, deliberate. She had learned over time that some battles were best left unspoken. "All right," she said quietly, tucking her ticket back into her bag. Without another word, Amelia turned toward the gate and boarded the plane, glancing once more at the first-class cabin as she made her way past it. She could feel the subtle shift in passengers' expressions as she passed, the way their eyes slid to her, reading her, making assumptions. Finally, she found her seat in the cramped economy row, slipping into it with a quiet sigh. Outside, the sun dipped behind heavy clouds, casting the tarmac in a muted gray. Amelia leaned back, putting on her headphones and closing her eyes. She focused on the hum of the engines, a sound she knew intimately, a sound she could almost command with her eyes shut. Today, she reminded herself, "I'm just a passenger." The plane ascended smoothly, slicing through the heavy clouds over Chicago as it rose into clear, blue skies. Settling back in her seat, Amelia tried to let go of the tension that still clung to her from the encounter at the gate. She adjusted her headphones, choosing a familiar jazz playlist, hoping it might ease her mind. Outside the small oval window, the sky stretched in endless shades of blue, calming and vast. Amelia loved this view. The quiet at 35,000 feet above the earth had always been a sanctuary for her, a place where her world narrowed down to the focused hum of engines and the thrilling freedom of flight. She allowed herself to unwind, pushing the strange treatment she'd received aside. if only for the next couple of hours. But tranquility proved fleeting. Just over 2 hours into the flight, with the plane cruising smoothly and the passengers deep into their routines, a sudden, violent lurch ripped through the cabin. The plane shuddered, banking hard to the right. Amelia's body was thrown against her seatbelt, and gasps erupted around her as passengers were jolted out of their calm. She instinctively grabbed the armrests, her mind racing to decipher the cause. Though seated, Amelia could feel the pulse of the engines in her bones. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She turned, scanning the cabin for the flight attendants, who were rushing up the aisle, their eyes wide with alarm. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, strained and unsteady. Good afternoon, folks. This is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some technical difficulties, and we ask that everyone remain calm. Our crew is working to resolve the issue. Please stay seated with your seatbelts fastened. The announcement did little to soothe the growing panic. Amelia could hear worried whispers around her, passengers looking anxiously out the windows or clutching their armrests. A woman a few rows down was already beginning to cry, her sobs piercing the tense silence. Amelia's heart pounded, but her years of training took over, sharpening her senses. She listened carefully, ears attuned to the faint rumbling coming from the engines. She knew the sounds of a jet, knew what normal turbulence felt like. And this was not normal. The plane dipped again, and a shiver of fear ran through her. Out of the corner of her eye, Amelia spotted the head flight attendant, whose face was drawn tight with fear. She watched as the attendants conferred in hushed, frantic tones. It was clear they were out of their depth. No one expected this level of trouble on a routine flight. She could almost feel the fear seeping from the cockpit into the cabin. Then, from her seat, Amelia caught snippets of conversation from the open cockpit door. The voices were tense, panicked. "We're not going to make it," the co-pilot muttered, his voice barely audible. "We need to land, but I don't think we can." A grim silence settled over the cabin as if everyone's breath had been stolen all at once. Amelia could see the desperation in the crew's faces as they fought to remain composed. Yet their fear was unmistakable. Her instincts screamed at her to do something, but she sat frozen, weighing the risks. Another shudder rocked the plane, this time harder, the nose dipping forward. The lights flickered briefly, then dimmed. Gasps and murmurs broke out, and in the subdued glow of the emergency lighting, Amelia's decision was made. She unbuckled her seatbelt, standing up amid the swaying of the cabin and the fearful murmurs of passengers. With a calm that belied the turmoil around her, Amelia started down the narrow aisle, her footsteps measured and steady, each one an assertion of the resolve she had cultivated over her years as a pilot. Reaching the cockpit door, she squared her shoulders and rapped firmly. The captain, his face pale and taut, looked up in shock as Amelia stepped forward. "My name is Captain Amelia Hayes," she said, her voice low and steady, her gaze unwavering. "I'm a pilot, and I can help." Captain Wilson's brow furrowed, skepticism flickering across his face. "You're a passenger." Amelia didn't blink, holding his gaze with the unbreakable certainty of someone who knew what it took to control a plane under pressure. "I've logged over 5,000 hours in the cockpit, and I've managed situations like this before. Let me take over." For a moment, a tense silence hung between them. The captain exchanged a hesitant glance with his co-pilot, who gave a reluctant nod. Captain Wilson's face softened, his defenses dropping. "All right, Captain Hayes," he said, stepping aside. "Let's get this plane home." Amelia's heart raced, but as her hands settled over the controls, a familiar calm washed over her. With quick, practiced precision, she assessed the instruments, her mind calculating, her body responding with the reflexes of a seasoned pilot. She was back in her element. Around her, the cockpit filled with the quiet hum of determination. And as Amelia guided the plane back toward Chicago, the shadows of doubt from earlier that day melted away, leaving only a fierce focus. She was more than a passenger, more than her appearance, and today she would prove it. Amelia's fingers danced over the controls, their movements precise and confident. The weight of the aircraft felt familiar beneath her hands. The tremors and jerk, something she had come to understand deeply in her years as a pilot. The smell of the cockpit, cool, metallic, tinged with the faint scent of burnt wiring, filled her senses. It was a space she knew as well as her own pulse. Beside her, Captain Wilson and the co-pilot, Matt Johnson, sat tense, still rattled by the sudden takeover. The cockpit was thick with an uneasy silence, broken only by the subtle beeping of indicators. Amelia's eyes scanned the control panel, her brain working in overdrive as she calculated their trajectory and adjusted their speed. The engines had stabilized somewhat, but the plane still needed immediate attention. "Fuel levels are dropping faster than they should," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We're in for a rough ride if we don't make adjustments now." Captain Wilson's face was pale, his earlier disbelief now replaced with a grudging respect. He looked over at her, the lines of worry on his forehead deepening. "You really know what you're doing?" Amelia didn't respond. She was already ahead of him, flipping switches, adjusting dials, recalibrating the engines with a level of focus that shut out everything but the task before her. In the back of her mind, she registered the passengers' voices growing louder, echoing their anxiety through the cabin walls. But right now, she couldn't let herself think about the dozens of people behind her, their lives clinging to each move she made. She was here to bring them home safely, and that's what she would do. A crackling sound interrupted her concentration, and a voice came over the intercom. It was the flight attendant. "Captain Hayes, this is Jenna in the cabin. The passengers, they're getting scared. Is there anything we can tell them?" Amelia took a steadying breath, pressing the intercom button. "Jenna, please reassure everyone that we're handling the situation. Let them know we're working to land back in Chicago as safely as possible. Remind them to stay seated with their seatbelts fastened." She could almost hear the relief in Jenna's voice as she responded with a quick, "Yes, ma'am." Before ending the call, Amelia turned back to the controls, her eyes scanning the panel. The engines were still fragile, each flicker of the lights another reminder of how critical the next few minutes were. She needed to lower their altitude, slow their descent, and maintain control long enough to guide them back. "Matt," she said, glancing at the co-pilot, who was watching her with a mix of awe and relief. "I'll need your help monitoring the right engine. We're losing thrust, and if we don't keep it steady, we won't have enough power to make the landing." Matt nodded, his hands returning to the controls with newfound purpose. Together, they worked in sync, Matt adjusting the engine levels as Amelia managed their descent. Captain Wilson, no longer skeptical, took his position as her support, ready to follow her lead. As they dipped below the clouds, Chicago's skyline began to emerge in the distance. The lights from the city flickered against the dimming sky, a hopeful beacon as they approached. Amelia's jaw tightened as she began the landing sequence, each maneuver a testament to her skill and years of experience. In the cabin, the passengers sensed a change. Whispers rippled through the rows, people craning their necks to peer out the windows, gasping as the lights of the city grew closer. Amelia could feel their collective breath, their anticipation, their fear. But with each adjustment she made, the plane steadied, the tension in the air easing with the knowledge that they were close. As they neared the runway, Amelia's hands gripped the controls with a quiet resolve. She kept her focus locked on the blinking lights marking the landing strip below, guiding them down with a precision that held all of her strength, all of her dedication. She adjusted the flaps, slowing their speed, lining up the aircraft with practiced ease. "Landing gear deployed," Matt confirmed, his voice steady. With a final surge of determination, Amelia brought the plane down. The wheels touched the tarmac with a slight jolt, then rolled smoothly, gliding across the runway as the aircraft slowed to a halt. The cabin erupted in applause. Cheers of relief filling the air as passengers clapped and even hugged each other. Amelia could hear it all from the cockpit, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she powered down the engines. Captain Wilson turned to her, his expression one of gratitude and respect. "Thank you, Captain Hayes. You saved us today." Amelia met his gaze, her own eyes calm and unwavering. "Just doing my job," she said quietly, though she knew it was more than that. It was proof of her skill, her worth, her strength. Today, she had shown them all who she truly was. Amelia sat back, her hands slowly easing off the controls as the adrenaline began to drain from her system. The roar of applause continued from the cabin, and though she couldn't see their faces, she could feel the raw gratitude in every clap, every cheer. The relief in the air was almost palpable, like a collective exhale after a breath held too long. Captain Wilson, still seated beside her, ran a hand over his face, clearly shaken. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect that, moments earlier, had been tinged with doubt. Now, there was no question in his mind of what she was capable of. He had seen it firsthand, the calm command, the flawless expertise, the quiet strength. "Captain Hayes," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "You didn't just save these passengers. You saved us all." Amelia offered him a small nod, keeping her own emotions in check. She could feel the gravity of what had just happened, the weight of lives that had been in her hands. Yet as much as this moment filled her with pride, she couldn't ignore the sting of the day's earlier events, the casual dismissal, the unfounded assumptions. Today had forced her to prove herself yet again. And though she had done so triumphantly, there was a weariness to the victory. As she stood up, the cockpit door swung open, and Jenna, the head flight attendant, stepped in, her face pale and damp with relief. She looked at Amelia as though seeing her for the first time. "Captain Hayes," she said, voice unsteady, "I don't know how to thank you. The passengers, everyone. You saved us." Amelia offered a reassuring smile. "It was a team effort," she replied, nodding toward Captain Wilson and Matt, who both acknowledged her with grateful expressions. But Jenna shook her head slightly, her gaze lingering on Amelia as though realizing just how much she had misjudged her. "We all owe you more than we can say," Jenna whispered, her face a mix of relief and something else, an apology. Perhaps. Amelia sensed it but didn't dwell on it, choosing instead to accept the gratitude in Jenna's eyes. Stepping out of the cockpit, Amelia was met by a scene of absolute relief and admiration. Passengers, some still seated, others standing in the narrow aisle, erupted into another round of applause as she entered the cabin. Faces lit up with awe and gratitude turned toward her, a mix of strangers united by the harrowing experience they had just endured together. "Thank you, Captain," someone shouted from the back, followed by a chorus of agreement. A young mother held her child close, looking at Amelia with tearful appreciation. An older man gave her a nod, one hand clutching his heart in silent acknowledgement of the life she had saved. Amelia took a breath, letting the warmth of their appreciation wash over her. For years, she had worked toward this moment, not for the applause or the acknowledgement, but for the impact she could make. Yet standing here now, seeing the relief on their faces, she felt a new kind of pride settle into her. As she made her way through the cabin, passengers reached out, some to shake her hand, others simply to offer words of thanks. The whispers, the skeptical glances from before, had vanished, replaced by something rare and precious: respect. Genuine, unfiltered respect. Just as she was about to leave the plane, Amelia's gaze fell on Becky, the gate agent who had dismissed her at the start of the journey. Becky stood near the exit, eyes downcast, her face pale and expression unsure. She seemed to wrestle with her own discomfort, shifting her weight from one foot to the other before finally meeting Amelia's gaze. Becky began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize." Amelia held her gaze for a long moment, letting the silence fill the space between them. Then, with the same calm composure that had carried her through the flight, she simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement. It was enough to leave Becky standing there, her face flushed with regret as Amelia continued on her way. The airport staff gathered near the gate burst into applause as she stepped onto the jetway. But Amelia kept her focus forward. She had faced down far greater challenges in the air, had fought through prejudice and doubt to stand where she stood today, and had saved lives because she was not only capable but exceptional. And now, every eye that watched her, every hand that clapped, was a testament to that truth. Today, she had guided them all to safety not just through the skies, but through the walls of bias and ignorance that had surrounded her. And for the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, those walls had begun to crack. As Amelia stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the reality of the past hours hit her in waves. She had saved a plane full of passengers, calmed a cabin of strangers, and walked out of that cockpit knowing she had done everything right. Yet, as she entered the terminal, surrounded by passengers who had just moments ago been strangers and were now lifelong witnesses to her skill, she felt a rare mix of pride and relief that cut through her usual composure. Captain Wilson exited right behind her. His demeanor entirely changed from the cautious, somewhat dismissive pilot she had encountered before. Now, he stepped forward with humility, reaching out his hand. His expression was one of deep respect and a gratitude that went beyond words. "Captain Hayes," he said, his voice strong but layered with awe. "I've flown for 20 years, but I've never seen anything like that. You brought us home. He paused, almost uncertain how to finish. "I'm honored to have been your co-pilot today." Amelia shook his hand firmly, her own gratitude in her gaze. "Thank you, Captain Wilson. I was glad to have you and Matt alongside me." It was the truth. In those critical moments, it had been teamwork and trust that brought them all safely back. Passengers continued to pass by, some stopping to thank her again, others giving her small, tearful smiles of appreciation. One man, carrying his young daughter on his hip, stopped directly in front of her. His little girl looked at Amelia with wide eyes, clinging to her father's shirt. "You saved my family," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. We all owe you everything." Amelia's heart swelled as she smiled warmly at the little girl, giving her a reassuring wave. "I'm just glad you're all safe," she replied softly. The father nodded, still clutching his daughter as he turned to walk away, glancing back with grateful eyes. As Amelia made her way toward baggage claim, she felt the presence of someone approaching. Turning, she found herself face to face with Becky Martin, the gate agent who had denied her seat at the start of the flight. Becky's face was flushed, her eyes downcast, her hands twisting nervously. "Captain Hayes," she started, her voice trembling. She lifted her gaze, struggling to find words. "I'm so sorry. I misjudged you. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have. I was wrong." Amelia watched her, a quiet strength in her gaze. Becky's face mirrored regret and shame, and for a long moment, Amelia let the silence hang between them, feeling the weight of Becky's words. "Thank you for saying that," Amelia finally replied, her voice even but warm. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." Becky nodded, visibly relieved yet clearly humbled, before quietly stepping away. Just as Amelia turned to leave, she heard her name again, this time over the airport's PA system. "Captain Amelia Hayes, please report to the main terminal." Curious, she made her way toward the terminal, where she was greeted by the airline's executive team. They had gathered, their faces solemn but filled with respect. And in the center stood the airline's CEO, a tall woman with a sharp but warm expression. "Captain Hayes," the CEO began, extending her hand. "I've read your record, and it's impressive. But what you did today goes beyond skill or experience. It's an inspiration." Amelia took the CEO's hand, humbled by the words. "Thank you. I was just doing what any pilot would do." "Perhaps," the CEO replied, But you did it under pressure that most would struggle to withstand. Today, you didn't just represent our airline. You represented strength, courage, and resilience. We're lucky to have you. She gave Amelia a small, proud smile and then added, "We'd like to honor your contribution with a public recognition for your courage and leadership." The crowd of passengers, staff, and crew who had gathered broke into applause, their faces filled with genuine admiration. Amelia's heart swelled as she looked around at the sea of faces, each one a testament to what she had achieved. As the crowd dispersed, Amelia walked toward the exit, her shoulders held high and her steps filled with purpose. The day's events had been a reminder of the work that remained to be done, of the biases and judgments that still lingered. But she knew now, more than ever, that she had shattered expectations, cracked the walls of doubt and prejudice that had stood between her and others. With a deep breath, she stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, the city lights glimmering against the dusk. This was only one flight, only one victory, but it was hers. And as she looked out over the skyline, Amelia knew she was just getting started. Today, she had not only earned respect, she had claimed it, not just for herself, but for every young woman, every person of color, every individual who would follow in her footsteps. And that, she knew, was a legacy that would last far longer than any flight path.